Does military intervention work? Today on The Curious Task, I speak with Paul Robinson. Welcome to The Curious Task from the Institute for Liberal Studies, where we explore economics, politics, philosophy, and other ideas from a classical liberal perspective through discussion. I'm Alex Aragona, your host, and today our guest is Paul Robinson. Paul is a former military officer. He served in the British Army Intelligence Corps and in the Canadian Forces Reserves. He is now a professor at the University of Ottawa. His research focuses generally on military affairs and international relations. More recently, his focus has been on Russian history, military history, defense policy, and military ethics. When he's not lecturing, he's making sure he has enough content for his blog, Irrationality, which focuses on the relationship between Russia and the West and what he says are the irrational decision-making processes that dominate international relations. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. So, Paul, in each episode, we start with a question and go wherever the answers lead us. You're an international relations expert. You're the man to tell us, does military intervention work?
That depends very much on what you mean by work. If I sort of put a lawyerly hat on, say define your terms. For a military strategist who would be thinking in terms sort of laid down by the great strategists from Prussia, Karl von Clausewitz, should be some political objective to any military action. And that means that if this is a mission-oriented activity, that there's a specific goal you have in mind. So if you're defining whether it works or not, theoretically what you're asking is, does military intervention achieve the political objectives which lie behind it? That does kind of assume a certain degree of rationality on the part of the actor. The actor actually does have clearly defined goals which can be said to have worked or not worked. But very often, of course, that is not the case. So before we can even begin to unwrap that question, we have to start thinking about, well, why do politicians carry out military interventions? What are they trying to achieve? And if we ask that question, when we can have some idea of understanding whether they work or not. The problem is it's actually quite a difficult question to answer. So, there's a number of reasons you might do it. One is for your own security. So, for instance, the wars which have been fought by the United States and its allies, including Canada, in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, had a security dimension. That is to say, officially at least, one can argue about how much, that is really what's going on, but officially at least, these are driven by some understanding that there's a threat to our security in those parts of the world, which we have to eliminate through military action, and that through that we will be safer. Right? So therefore, if you're going to say, well, have they worked, you'd have to say, well, have they succeeded in eliminating the military threat? And are we safer? Because, even if you've eliminated the military threat, you might be less safe in some other way, because you might, for instance, have incited domestic terrorism against you or annoyed a lot of people. So purely just achieving the military objective isn't the same as achieving the political objective.
Right.
So then you'd have to say, well, has Canada, for instance, become safer as a result of its military actions in Afghanistan and more recently in Iraq? And well, it's very hard to say because it's a kind of a counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened if we hadn't got there. But the evidence would suggest, it's not very positive. The scale of threat which the Taliban ever throws to Canada was pretty tiny to begin with. But we may have annoyed a lot of people, which may have incited some domestic terrorism. It's very hard to judge these things. But has it made Afghanistan better off? Well, no, not obviously. The Taliban are still functioning. So that clearly, that particular one has not been a success. If you look more broadly at Iraq, the Americans and the British supposedly went into Iraq in order to eliminate threats from weapons of mass destruction, therefore in order to make themselves safer. Have they made themselves safer? Well, quite clearly not. They've made a total hash of things.
From the threat of global terrorism. They haven't made themselves safer, is what we're saying.
Yeah, but of course, the threat they were claiming to be against, which was weapons of mass destruction, didn't exist. But
I see. Okay, yes.
But then they destabilized society, which led eventually to thousands of Americans and hundreds of Brits losing their lives fighting insurgents in Iraq. It then led to the rise of the Islamic State. which caused further problems. Particularly the Brits have been suffering from terrorism from the Islamic State. So it's very hard to say that any of this has made them safer. So in purely security terms, it's hard to say that recent interventions have worked. Now, does that mean they couldn't work and that you can't find examples where you have? No, it's just that recent examples have not been very successful.
Right.
But that's looking at it purely, obviously, from a security perspective. If you don't mind if I make this a very long answer. But,
of course, go ahead.
But okay, there's also other things which are claimed for here. For instance, humanitarian goals. So interventions have been often justified in recent years by talk about human rights, saving people's lives, and so on and so forth. Have these worked? Again, I mean, it's hard to say that, the human rights situation in Afghanistan has got massively better. Now, perhaps it's better than before the Americans went in 2001, but since about 2002, it obviously hasn't drastically improved. Similarly, like Iraq has obviously been a disaster. Libya, which we claimed was a humanitarian intervention, has clearly gone completely pear-shaped. And has spilled over also into places like Mali, and then weapons from Libya spread into Syria and so on into the hands of jihadists there. The American intervention on behalf of rebel groups in Syria has also gone badly wrong. We had a spectacle at one point of CIA-backed insurgents fighting Pentagon-backed insurgents. All sorts of crazy nonsense, which have just resulted in a lot more death and suffering. So, again, does this mean that you can't do some good and protect people through the use of force? Theoretically, you can. It's just we don't have, in recent years, many good examples of it.
Right. The distinction you made between achieving the military objective, I guess, versus the political objective, I think, is a very interesting one. Because, as you said, would there be military strategists and people that were quote leading the charge on these operations that would say, well, we've achieved our mission, but then the politicians can't turn around, as you were sort of saying, and say, well, we've made things safer, or we've squashed terrorism, or, like you said, we've actually achieved our humanitarian goals. So what you're saying is it is possible to have those two perspectives collide and actually be at odds then.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, often you'll speak to soldiers and say, well, we've won every battle. And you'll say, well, yeah, but so what? Right? I mean, if you haven't achieved the political objective for which the battles are being fought, that's really besides the point. And if we go back to Clausewitz again, in his famous book on war, he talks about the possibility of how the political objective and the military objective can diverge. Because once you start fighting a war, to achieve your political objective, you have to overcome the enemy. So therefore, you need to defeat him militarily. So therefore, you start focusing on the military objective, and war just becomes a process of defeating the enemy, and you kind of forget why you're defeating the enemy, what the hell this is all for.
Right.
So why are we in Afghanistan, or why the Americans still in Afghanistan? Well, because we haven't defeated the enemy yet, right? And but what good it's doing you anymore has been sort of forgotten.
Or Iraq as an example, right? I don't think anyone said the goal was to overthrow the regime, but clearly they've succeeded in doing so through that process. But the goal, as you said, was weapons of mass destruction or humanitarian issues. Those were the political goals.
Well, I mean, those were the stated. I mean, that's when we get into more subtle things, where we thought about what are the unstated.
I think you were.
What are the unstated?
You're actually about to go into something I wanted to get to, which is great. Which is that how often would you say that are the political, let's say the stated political goals, actually different from let's call them the behind closed door political goals?
Yeah, I mean, very often. So if we would consider the invasion of Iraq, the stated political goal is to keep America safe from weapons of mass destruction. However, there's obviously an element within the American government at the time who have issues with Saddam Hussein and want to get rid of him for personal reasons related to the Bush family, maybe, or also because of issues related to Israel, or all sorts of things. You can develop whatever, or oil. You can develop whatever conspiracy theory you particularly want. But there's other things going on there. Similarly, if we look at why Canada sent forces to Afghanistan, clearly the political objective we say is that we want to make Canada safe and contribute towards the defeat of terrorism. But there's other things going on here as well, which is, for instance, being a good ally.
From the Canadian perspective,
yes,
we're talking now, exactly, right?
So we're there just because, well, by being there, we hope we'll win brownie points. Now, whether we actually do or not is highly questionable, but
Right.
we think we do. Now, this, of course, creates problems for strategy, because if you've achieved your political objective just by being there, it doesn't really matter what you do when you're there, whether you win or you lose, right? So this is not conducive to desperately good strategy.
Right. If showing up to the party is all you need to do to get the points, it doesn't matter how the party goes. Right?
Exactly, right? And that may go some way towards explaining what a hash of many people have made of things. But then there's other things maybe going on. There is in one book which was written about Canadian decision making in Afghanistan. It said that there was some issues about where in Afghanistan Canadian forces would go, and the generals, they chose the most dangerous bit because they wanted. Well, they wanted a bit of practice.
Right.
And it sounds rather cynical, but when you go into issues, for instance, to do with military-industrial complexes and so on, and you find that generals tend to be very reluctant to get out of these things. There's promotion, there's medals, there's glory, there's all sorts of other stuff going on.
Right.
And of course, there's contracts and money and all sorts of stuff. So these things are also driving the process, and they kind of work just by, as you say, just by being there, by turning up to the party.
Well, let's get into the other motivations a little bit, because I think Iraq and Afghanistan are both very good ways to explore this. And of course, you could use whatever example you'd like, but it just occurs to me that as we're talking about this, that even though there were stated political goals as the Iraq for Americans operations was going on and for Canadians Afghanistan was going on post 9/11, there were a lot of people who didn't really believe in those stated political goals anyway. Like, some people thought it was just purely a corporatist intentions there, like oil, right? That was a big thing everyone talked about. Right. Other people thought, as you said, that this was just about the Bush legacy and things like that. As someone who studied these things, would you say that it's just a mishmash of all these things, including good intentions by politicians that get peppered in there? Are the conspiracy theorists right, which is that there's zero good intentions going on here? How do we make more sense of this? Because when you talk to one person or the other, especially people that aren't specialized in this field, they may say, oh, here's the one reason Iraq happened, oil. And you talk to someone else and they say, no, we needed to get rid of Saddam Hussein. How much of a mixture of all these issues coming together are there? Or is there usually one surefire thing that people are planning behind closed doors and that's it?
No, I think human decision making is extremely complicated, and the idea that there's, as I said, this Clausewitzian view that war is or I'm just going to say about any public policy, but it has a clear objective, and some politician on top has, in what you might call a rational top-down decision-making process, has determined the goal, and then everything flows logically from that. Is not how human beings operate, and it's not how institutions operate, and it's not how state structures operate. What happens is a multifaceted bunch of things all get thrown into a pot together to produce some result which is perhaps not desperately clear in terms of what objective is really going on. So, I would not say that good intentions are absent. I think, people believe their own propaganda. If they say that, we're going to make the world a better place and we're going to help the poor, impoverished people of wherever land, I think they believe that they are the good guys and they're fighting the bad guys, and then good will overcome evil and all this stuff.
At least we hope they believe that.
Yeah, I think they generally. I think generally most people think they're the good guy, right? I mean,
that's fair to say. I think
probably 99% of people think they're the good guy,
right?
Okay, even when they're obviously not, but that's the way human beings think, right? But that does not mean that they're also not driven by personal motives or that corporate interests or that institutional interests are not at play, and also that organizational structures are not at play. So simply the way certain bureaucracies or institutions function will be different in one place to another place just because of the way they're structured or organized, and that will affect the outcome of the process.
So would an example be like that? Be for that the way the Canadian interest structure would work versus the American interest structure?
Yeah, exactly. We have a different constitution and a different structure of government. So we will, even if you put the same in, even if Canada and the United States somehow had the same wealth and the same size of population and everything else was equal, if you put the same information in, something different would come out simply as a product of a different structure, right? Therefore, policy can be seen sometimes simply as a product of structure,
right?
Which is not very rational at all, really.
Right?
But that's the way things work. And in something like Iraq, oil, right? Is it there? Is it not? Well, not obviously. I don't think the Americans invaded in order to seize the Iraqi oil. If they did, it hasn't worked because they haven't got it, right?
Right.
So that much is clear. But that said, I think there's a reason why the Americans have been so muddled up in the Middle East, much more than, say, Africa, right? Which is clearly that there's money there, and there's an important strategic resource there. And I think that it's not that you're invading in order to grab the resource. It's more that at some point in time, the resources pulled you in there and made you identify this whole region as being some sort of vital interest, and it's just become a fixated part of your policymaking process, which attracts your attention and pulls you in and makes you think that this place matters in a way that it doesn't somewhere else. So it has an effect, but perhaps more indirect than you might imagine.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to, quote, I guess you could say imperial interest, how much does, in your observation, how much does the West have these kinds of interests? Of course, when we listen to our media, we will hear that whether it be China, Russia, or any of the other, quote, geopolitical rivals, as they say, go and do something. They send a fleet somewhere, they send some infantry somewhere, they do a show of force. It's because they're the bad guys and they might have imperial interests. And of course, it's usually portrayed that when the West were to do something, it's reported on that, well, we're either defending something or defending a vital interest or doing the good stuff. As you said before, we're the good guys. Not a lot of people tend to think of either Canada or the United States as participating in strictly like imperialist activities. How much does this sort of political reality play into the West's decision making, would you think? It's not often portrayed that way, at least in the media.
It's very hard to judge this kind of thing because we're talking about hidden objectives and what's really going on in people's minds and strategic thinking. Now,
can we tell from the results, though, at least what we see is actually happening versus what's being said to happen?
Well, I mean, some people do, write in general imperial geopolitical type terms. I mean, there are texts of geopolitical theory, which some people who don't like United States policy will pull out. So the Russians like to quote Brzezinski in his book, The Grand Chessboard, which is seen as sort of the blueprint of American geopolitics and so on. I don't think that's probably over-exaggerates, I think, the importance of one person. But there are people who do express things in a very blunt way. Most Western politicians don't like to do that, though, because it's not PC.
Well, yeah.
Basically, right? So we talk about we're defending the liberal international order.
Right.
Or whatever, or the rules-based
liberal democratic institutions,
we talk about things like this. That doesn't mean, though, that there's not some hard-headed geopolitical stuff going on as well. But it's very hard to disentangle it from everything else. So, for instance, if we were to look at the war in Ukraine, which has been going on there, this is clearly. Ukraine has become essentially a proxy ground in a geopolitical struggle. I mean, that's not the sole cause of this war. There are clearly long-standing and important domestic causes of why Ukrainians are fighting one another right now. But geopolitical interests and what if you wanted to put it in terms of imperialism, what you could call imperialism, have a part of it, because you had essentially a couple of competing geopolitical projects, the Eurasian Economic Union on the Russian side and the European Union's Eastern Partnership on the other, clashing. And the European Eastern Partnership, or EU would hotly deny this, I'm sure. And they would say it's just about bringing good governance and free markets and stuff like this. And
the good stuff.
All the good stuff. Yeah. We do know that the two people who set it up, Carl Bildt and Radek Sikorski, who were the foreign ministers of Poland and Sweden and had a strong role in pushing this, did so with a geopolitical objective in mind, which was we would pull Eastern European post-Soviet states out of the Russian orbit into the European orbit. Now that is, and then we can blame out the Russians are trying to have a sphere of influence, but that's clearly sphere of influence politics going on too. Just we mask our imperial projects in terms of democracy building and so on, but that doesn't mean we're not imperial projects at the same time.
So having said that, though, can you point to some fundamental differences between the way Western states, let's call them, approach international affairs and intervention compared to places that we always hear about are the, quote, bad guys sometimes, right, like China and Russia? I know we talked earlier that when you really get into it, the incentive structures may be different constitutions, different way the states are made up. But when you bring it up to the grand scheme of things, are these just states trying to exert their influence? I know I'm simplifying, but is this ultimately what we're talking about here? Or I know we talked to mix before, but the people seem to want to draw, or at least detail, a fundamental distinction between the intentions or the way that these two sides of the world go about things. Is it really that different when you really get into it?
Not really, actually. I mean, I'm not a totally hard-headed realist, as they call them, with a capital R in international relations theory. Nonetheless, there is a lot to what realists say, in that states pursue their interests and they seek to maximize their power. Now, there's many good ways of doing that as well as bad ways, and you can do it through coalitions, not through expansion and so on. But essentially, the states do always try and pursue their interests, and people like the Russians and the Chinese, they pursue their interests as they see them, and actually they do so, actually, I'd say, rather less aggressively than many Western states do. It's just that when their pursuit of their interest happens to clash with our pursuit of our interests, or as what we perceive to be our interests in some way, at that point, when you have a conflict of interest, that's when we start accusing the other side of aggression or whatever. But really, they're not actually behaving desperately differently to where we are. And if you were to look at who fights the most wars in the world, it's not Russians, it's not the Chinese. Okay, it's first of all the Brits. Okay, historically since 1945, United Kingdom's fought more wars than any other country, followed by the French, followed by the Americans. Okay,
there's the top three.
We've had the top three. The Russians come in fourth. For the statistics I saw, Australians come in fifth because they tag along with the Brits and the Americans. Chinese, I don't think have fought a war since 1979 in Vietnam. All right, so.
But a lot of are you in that statistical lineup? Are we talking about just anytime there's military action, or these like quote declared wars? I know that doesn't happen anymore. Where is that?
Well, a lot of these.
From?
Part of the reason the French and the Brits are so high up on this scale is like post 1945. There are a lot of post-colonial wars in those statistics.
Right. Okay.
But so these do make things lopsided a little bit. They're not all interstate wars. Some of them will be civil wars or colonial wars or whatever. But they would be conflicts in which your armed forces are directly involved in some way.
Gotcha. So for instance, like all the action in the Middle East, the United States has been taking for the past few years, like in that list, that would be classified as either like the Iraq War or what they were doing in Afghanistan. It wouldn't be just, for instance, you can't just count like the fight against global terrorism on that list.
No. I mean, there's several wars. The Americans are involved in a war.
Right.
They're fighting a war in Syria. That's clear. They're fighting a war in Iraq. You could conflate those into one war, but that's. They're very much some definitional issues.
Gotcha.
They, of course, were involved in the war in Libya in 2011. They're involved in the war in Afghanistan. And there's also some conflicts going on in Africa, though the extent to which you could say they're at war, because I think the level of involvement is fairly minor. I probably wouldn't be added to the statistics.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, I think this provides a great intro. We're about to take a break, actually. Time flew by right there. But I think, you tell me, is it fair to say that anyone listening to this as the conversation continues should at least feel that in order to come to the table and at least try and understand and make sense of how the world works, you can't start by assuming that your side's the good guy?
No, absolutely. I think we need more critical self-reflection before we are able to unravel what's going on.
Cool. And we'll be doing more of that after the break. The Curious Task is a podcast from the Institute for Liberal Studies. Feel free to send us questions and feedback to curioustask@liberalstudies.ca. A special thanks to our supporters on Patreon, including Janet Buffton, Joe Aragona, and Travis Smith. Remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter @CuriousTaskILS, and rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you're listening to The Curious Task. Everyone, welcome back. We're talking with Paul Robinson today. Paul, before the break, we just said that for anyone to make sense of what's going on in the world, especially when it comes to international relations, it's important that people don't come to the table thinking, wow, my side's the good guy. And we were talking a little bit during the break how it's important to understand that although it's very easy to go and criticize other regimes or people that you don't think are, quote, on your side, one must start with sort of some critical self-reflection, you were saying, in order to even begin to make sense of things.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. I was reading some article by a Norwegian scholar recently about Russian-Western relations, which said that the fundamental problem was a mutual lack of critical introspection. So both sides were saying, like, you're a bad guy, you've done this, you've done that, you invaded Ukraine, or you invaded Iraq, or whatever, right? So on and so forth. And no one actually ever sits down and says, well, what have I done wrong? Well, maybe the other guy's got a point. Maybe I've done something which isn't right, and in fact, our politicians are really don't like this, and they'll say, like Chrystia Freelander said, but this is what's the exact expression said, false equivalency, right? But just to say there's any equivalency between what the Russians have done and what we've done is just completely untrue. And the Russians will go, well, hang on, how many people died during the takeover of Crimea? Like one. How many people died during the invasion of Iraq and since? Hundreds of thousands, right? So yeah, if there's a false equivalency, it's on your side, right? So, it's easy to come back on these things, but our politicians really don't like to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So
and for those listening, that was just the Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada being name dropped. Yeah.
So in terms of, say, think about what's wrong with Russia and the West at the moment, each side does have some legitimate grievances about what the other side has done, but so obviously the Russians have done some things that we don't like, but similarly, we've done some things that they don't like, and simply to cast the blame on the other person all the time can't possibly help address the problems, because you're not addressing the real root of the problem, which is your own misbehavior.
Right.
And until you begin to actually recognize that you're not behaving very well all the time,
right,
then you're not going to make a lot of progress.
I think part of the problem is that in the political arena, like when you're trying to score votes with voters, it doesn't pay dividends to basically say, look, guys, let's start with a critical self-reflection on what's been going on here. I think the problem is they say, we're the good guys, we need more of the good stuff, so vote for me and I'll give you more good stuff, basically. Yeah. So I think that's probably one of the big issues, is that they can, on the in international relations, and when countries and states are dealing with each other, that's one thing, but on the other hand, turning around to your citizens saying, look, we've been doing some pretty shitty things for the past little while isn't going to work out for a lot of politicians. I think that's a major issue.
It is, and politicians who have done this have not got very far. I mean, if you look at, in Canada, it hasn't happened at all. There is basically zero critical self-reflection among our politicians.
That's a really good point. I haven't stopped to actually think about that until you just mentioned that, but that's really true. You'd have to dig deep to find, you probably have to go into academic journals and things to talk about that, not the news, for sure.
So if you go in, if you look at America, there have been not many, but now one or two. So like there was Ron Paul.
Right.
Who clearly hammered this point home again and again.
He was very much against a lot of the language and rhetoric that was starting up at the time when he was running the election about Iran. I mean, we still have it today. Yeah. But at the time, I remember that was a big election issue for him. I think he was running in 2012 for sure. Yeah. As president. And
there's excellent video, actually, his election campaign put together one, sort of Ron Paul Revolution one, which was like, what would it be like if Chinese troops appeared in Texas and blah, 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 blah.
Right.
It was put forward this very powerful point of like, think of how what we're doing looks like to other people.
Exactly.
Right. But of course, I mean, he was fairly much of a fringe candidate. Now, Trump, when he was standing for election, there are many people on the sort of anti-interventionist right who thought, finally, like, there's a candidate who understands that this is a load of nonsense and this doesn't work, because he sort of picked up on the Ron Paul type language and ran with it and said, I'm going to end these wars. They don't achieve anything.
We're tangled up. It's a waste of money.
Yeah, we're going to bring the troops back home. Mm-hmm. And then he didn't. And then he appointed John Bolton and everybody else. And now, we're almost at war with Iran. So even when a politician says these things, they backtrack on them. And now the only candidate really pushing these now is Tulsi Gabbard on the Democratic hustings. But she's not going to get very far. I think her ratings are like 1% or something. Right. So there are one or two people in America, but not not many, which is interesting because actually opinion polls suggest that there's actually quite a lot of demand for this, and but the public is
public is generally fed up with conflict.
Yes, and more or less on board with the idea that these things don't work and they don't.
Right.
It's not productive, and we shouldn't be doing so much of it. But for some reason, whatever reasons, politicians don't want to go there. As I said, in Canada, basically, I can't think of a politician who's gone down that line. In the UK, I mean, you have Jeremy Corbyn. Has a lot of baggage. There have been some former military officers in Britain who've written very critical books about the British Army and what it did in Iraq and Afghanistan, and said, we really messed up, and this is a really bad idea.
Do you think that the types of people we just named, is it back to what you said before, that they just think of themselves as the good guys, and that's why there's not a lot of people, or is it just strictly political incentive? Are there other vested interests, or is it that mix we were talking about?
I think it's the whole mix of it. I think that certainly there's no not seen as being a serious political advantage in pushing.
Well, you're going to catch a lot of flack if you come out as an MP or something like that, or a congressman in the United States, and say, hey, everything we were going about is wrong.
Yeah, and of course, in the particular area I study, which is Russia, in the aftermath of the whole Russiagate thing, it's anyone even begins to suggest that maybe Russia's not 100% to blame. You immediately would run the risk of being denounced as like a Kremlin agent, as a Russian proxy, as an agent of influence, a useful idiot, and all sorts of dirt will be flung at your name, and you'll be accused basically of taking money from Putin, probably personally in little brown packages.
And we should be clear and say that that's even not saying, Russia didn't have to do with this. Even people that try and start by saying maybe it wasn't as much of an influence, even the lighter side of the dissent against the main opinion, they are often shut down.
Yeah, absolutely. Down. And there is a definite effort to shut down people who dissent from mainstream opinions on certain issues.
Right.
Not on everything. I don't want to say we have no free speech,
of course. Yeah,
but there is actually quite an organized industry of lobby groups supporting certain policies who are very active and in shutting down people who don't like them.
Right, and we're many layers down in the analysis now too, because they have their own set of vested interests and incentive structures, the lobby groups and other people behind this stuff, and the people contributing to the types of information that the news gets as well. So that's very interesting. So we talked a lot about the incentives involved with all these types of conflicts, and I think some of the low-hanging fruit to get into some complexities are things like Iraq and Afghanistan, but something near and dear to the heart of Canadians is often peacekeeping missions, right? I mean, with a label like that, how are we going to say that's a vested interest, right? I mean, the idea is Canadian peacekeepers, Canadian troops go in, usually under a UN mission. They're there to do something great. Usually it's to make sure two sides of a conflict don't shoot each other. That's what's presented. Is this a safe zone for criticism, or can we say no? We can point to a lot of examples where, once again, we're back to sort of the vested interests that are behind this stuff, where the stated political goals are certainly different from the real ones.
Oh, well, I mean, yes, for everything you can. Of course, peacekeeping is something we don't do anymore, and we can get into what's happened to Canadian.
That's another thing too.
How Canadian foreign policy has, I think, in the last two administrations under both Trudeau and Harper has changed very dramatically, and I think become much less independent than it previously was. But anyway, if you go back to peacekeeping, if you think when Canada was, majorly into peacekeeping and in traditional peacekeeping, as opposed to the more, robust peace enforcement and peacemaking type thing people talk about now, which is really waging war with a blue helmet on, the traditional peacekeeping, there are certain reasons why countries like Canada and Norway were major advocates of it and played an important role in it, which was that it was a way of a middle-sized power to exercise some sort of independence on the world scene and to make a contribution which was uniquely its own and to win a certain degree of prestige and influence.
In other words, there's a reason that, at least from a political perspective, that people were so happy or at least were happy to rush to switching from peacekeepers to peacemakers. Although some of the Canadians might feel there's a bit of a national identity quote thing lost there. It's not as if the transition was hard for the people that were running the show.
Not necessarily, because national interests played a role in this all along, which is when you're a small military power, there's not a lot of point trying to be like small plus a tiny bit which is kind of where we're going at the moment, because you're still small compared with the Americans, right? You're never gonna make your mark as Canada as a military power.
No,
right?
Not without an aircraft carrier.
No, or five or something. Which clearly, we're not going to spend. Whereas you can make a mark doing something like peacekeeping. So that even that I wouldn't say it's not altruistic, and obviously this sense of doing good and bringing peace and so on is part of it. But it was also a way of building influence, and then also, as you say, building national identity, giving a sense of national pride, and that reaps political benefits for politicians because people feel good about their country, and they're more likely to re-elect politicians if they feel good about the country, and you could build up a nice story of peaceful Canada and how we're not American because Americans bomb people Vietnam, but we go build peace and so on. So even then, there is more going on than just you might imagine.
Right. And that's definitely the theme of this entire chat so far, is that it's never just sort of that caricature storybook, like there's the good guys, there's the bad guys. So it's very, very interesting to be talking about that. And you did allude to at the beginning where you're not, and correct me if I'm mistaking this or misquoting it, but you said you're not like you're not a full realist with a capital R. That is would it be fair to say at that point then you wouldn't be opposed to saying sometimes military intervention would be a good thing, or that there could be a good case to be made for it? Is there ever a good case to be made for it? And I understand that when it comes to the intentions and what you want to do versus the results of military intervention, those are two different questions. But from your perspective, when would be a good time for military intervention?
Well, if I get sort of philosophical
sure.
about this, and when you're in a difference between what you might call act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. So, if you're an act utilitarian, you would say, well, you measure each act by whether that act does more good or more harm, right? And if you're an act utilitarian, you say, well, yes, a case could be made for military intervention if in that individual case more good is going to come than more harm, and then you find some examples where that's happened. So you could say, for instance, when the British went into Sierra Leone in, I think, 1999, and they helped the government wipe out some armed gangs, and it was very quick, it was reasonably efficient, and it was reasonably successful. And you could say, look, military intervention can work. Okay, well, therefore we should not argue against military intervention because we have examples of it achieving goals relatively quickly and cost-free. If you're a rule utilitarian or rule consequentialist, you'd say, okay, fine, okay, in this one little case of Sierra Leone, okay, it worked. But, then we got Iraq and Afghanistan and all these other big monster failures against it. So is it really a good idea to say, yes, you can do this thing? Wouldn't it be better to ban it, to say, no, you shouldn't do it ever, even if that means missing out on the opportunities when you could do it? And then people say, well, that's awfully callous, because you're saying, well, okay, that means we should turn a blind eye when we could have done some good. Yeah, but then you rule utilitarian and say, yeah, but if you what you say is, oh, we'll do it whenever we think it's going to do good, you're going to do it all the time because you're always going to think it's going to.
Right.
We know from experience that you're going to be overly optimistic, and you're going to overestimate your chance of success every time, and then it becomes habit forming. So there's an American theologian called Walter Wink who wrote an interesting book in which he talks about the myth of redemptive violence. He talks and says that this is like one of the foundational myths of Western society, which is that this story which you can find in all your TV shows and everything, whether Buffy the Vampire Slayer or just Game of Thrones or whatever it is you're watching, right? But there's some bad guys there, and we're gonna bash their heads, and that will redeem.
Just watch a Western.
Yeah,
right?
that will redeem us all.
Right.
And this is deeply embedded in our psyche, and because of this, the wars which actually work and do good, he says, are even more dangerous than the ones which don't, because it's like the example you can pick on, like this one worked, and then everyone will roll with it and say, hey, so
even if the circumstances are entirely different, people say at a high level, oh, like intervention worked here, let's go intervene there.
Yeah, and then it just becomes a habit forming thing. So
are you gearing towards sort of saying on net this isn't really a good thing if you look at the evidence?
I would say if you look at net overall, go back to your original question, does it work? Overall, no. Okay. Therefore, if you're talking about what rules you should have in international society, the rules should be the ones which, if you're utilitarian, the rules should be the ones which maximize utility. So therefore, the rules should prohibit it. Does that mean that in the world of real politics, it's impossible to do it? No, because international law is not quite like national law. There's people ignore it when they really, 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 really want to. Mm-hmm. But if you allow flexibility into the rule, people will drive us, a truck for every tiny little loophole they can find.
And it's one thing to say, okay, it doesn't work. A lot of people say it just goes. Not only does it not work, it makes things much worse. Is that often true when you study like the different scenarios and different conflicts?
Well, certainly in the last 20 years, that's been the case. Mm. No, if you look at
like, for instance, it's made terrorism worse, because terrorism is a big thing of the past 20 years, right?
It's obvious it has made terrorism worse. Right. That is obvious. If you look at places where Western states have intervened militarily, they are almost always worse off. There's one or two examples you might use against Saudi if you want to talk about the Balkans, but even then, the situation is quite complex, and people are not very happy with what's going on in Bosnia and Kosovo and so on, even now. So, but when we're talking about military intervention, what we really need is war. It's a euphemism. We don't like to say we wage war, because again, that's kind of non-PC. Okay, but basically, we're talking about war.
It's interesting how language switches over time. I was watching some archive stuff from the 80s on C-SPAN from the States, and it was interesting to me how all the guests, there were no problem saying, oh, well, we're even politicians on there, right? Well, we're not just, we're going to bomb there, but we're not going to bomb there. And you turn on TV now, no one's talking about bombing people. It's talking about intervening.
Intervening, okay. You can sell it better, okay.
Yeah,
but basically, we're talking about waging war.
Right.
Now,
like people are going to get shot or bombed. That's
now, if you're going to ask, does war on average make things better off or worse off? Well, I think this is a pretty dumb question, because it's pretty obvious, but overall it makes things worse off.
Yes.
And it's interesting, like one moral philosopher said, an interesting way of looking at it, he said, like, a maximum of 50% of people can win a war. Right, because both sides can't win, right?
Right.
So like maximum of 50%. But actually, most of the time, most people, neither side really wins, right? Or if they do win, it wasn't worth winning,
right?
Overall,
in the broad, there's a lot of costs to war, and in the broadest sense. War is costly.
So I think you can say it is a statistical certainty that most people lose most wars.
There you go.
So it is almost like statistically certain that war is going to leave you worse off than better off.
Right.
And I think that is, when you're thinking about it, you should think of it in that terms. And you should also go back to Clausewitz. Clausewitz had this term where he talked about friction. He said friction was all these little things which get in the way of a plan. So you have a plan, but it never works the way you think it's going to do, because I don't know, people turn up late, or they're tired, or they just don't want to do it, or your machine breaks down at the last moment, or it snows, or and there's this accumulation of friction, which if it messes everything up, right? And something always goes wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then we were surprised, like, we invade Iraq and it doesn't turn out the way we want. People say, well, no one could have known that this would have happened. Well, okay, maybe they couldn't have known that this would have gone wrong.
Right.
But they should have known that something was bloody well going wrong. Because something always does.
Right. There's human beings running this thing. Yeah. Like, picture one of the worst school projects you've ever been on, but on a grand scale, right? Like, like you said, people come to work tired. They do this. Some guy didn't hand in his report on time or something, right? The friction. That's a very interesting
and
point.
War is crammed full of friction.
Right.
And particularly because it's something which really it's deeply emotional.
Right.
And people are afraid, and people are excited, and all these things going on, and that leads to, of course, very bad decisions being made, and all sorts of things, people not doing what they should be doing, or whatever. And you can expect that this is not going to go as planned.
Right.
And again, this is something I think our politicians don't think. We live in a hyper rational society. I would say, we're all Enlightenment people. And we've all been suckered in by this idea of social science. But, somehow there are rules to society and to social interaction, such as warfare or economics, right?
Right.
And if we can just decipher the rules and then apply the rules, then we can do X. Policy input X will lead to policy output Y. But it's not like life isn't like that.
Right.
And no two situations are ever the same. And Clausewitz also says, war is an interaction. It's not not like playing billiards that you hit a ball and you know the ball will go in a certain direction,
right,
because
which is on a contained table with a certain amount of outcomes.
But it's an interaction. Someone is pushing the ball back in a completely random way you cannot predict. So it's never input X.
Right.
Is never going to produce the same results twice. This time it produces Y, but next time it's going to produce Z, and the time after that it's going to produce alpha. And yet somehow we think, because we've got this hyper-rational sort of Enlightenment view of the world and scientific thinking, that we can control it, but we can't.
Right. It's a hopeful thought. It's like you're hoping. People hope for this, it seems, right? That even from a voter perspective, people might think, oh, I hope the people in charge and the people running this, like, they know what they're doing, right? They come and they have their press conference. But like you said, I think the billiard table or the pool table is a really good example of that, right? So someone might pick up a ball and throw it. Someone might take their ball and go home, right? There's tons of things that could happen. It's not like a pool game.
Yeah. So Greeks would have seen war as, Ares is a god of chaos, and like it's not, he controls you. You don't control him. But somehow we've lost that. We think we can use violence as a precision tool, and I think the increase of like precision guided weapons and all these kind of things, and science and technology has perhaps made this worse. And if you ally that to sort of Western rationalism, we're potentially, and you ally it, and of course to a certain arrogance about our own moral superiority, then we're in potentially dangerous territory.
Someone listening to this might say, oh, that's all fine and good. There's a lot of situations that are complicated, but someone might say, but there are some situations that are sort of, clear cut. Like, for instance, we were talking a little before we started the episode about the term rogue states, right? Somebody might say, well, and this might not be the best example now just because of recent events, but for instance, like North Korea, right? That this was a country that was used as an example for many years of, like, the rules don't apply to them, right? They might have nukes. They're doing what they might use nukes, I should say. They're doing what they want, and it always seems like, depending on the year, the option to maybe invade them or shut them down was always on the table, kind of thing, right? So like I said, someone might say that a rogue state is a clear-cut example of when we need to get involved. Is that historically true?
I mean, when did North Korea last attack anybody?
This is a good question.
Okay, I mean, North Korea has not fought a single war since 1953. So why are we, who fought I don't know how many wars since then, complaining about North Korean international politics? Now, I'm not a defender of the North Korean regime for its internal politics. It's clearly mismanaged its own country horribly badly for the past few decades.
Right.
But it's not particularly. I mean, it's done a few naughty things, like kidnappings of Japanese citizens back I think in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. It was doing that.
But you're saying relatively speaking.
But relatively speaking, okay, so it's got nuclear weapons, fine, and we don't like that because we want to have an anti-proliferation regime. However, the Indians have nuclear weapons, and the Pakistanis have nuclear weapons, and we don't call the Indians a rogue regime. We don't call the Israelis a rogue regime. They have nuclear weapons. So we need to be a little careful about this. It's a way of moralizing international relations. Similarly, like the Iranians,
Can you get into that a bit more before we move to Iran? Like, moralizing international relations, what does that tendency mean, like when people try to do that?
Well, I mean, what is you try and justify your own politics by essentially painting those with whom you have conflicts of interests in very morally negative tones.
Oh, like back to what we were saying before, it's like the caricature thing, right?
Yeah,
like,
and
gotcha.
There's a lot of this which goes on, and of course, sometimes these states, because of their own domestic policies,
right?
Like in the case of North Korea, it's quite easy to do it. Right, because it's not a particularly pleasant regime, right? So
or Iraq under Saddam Hussein, for instance.
Yeah,
right.
But I think you need to be very careful to draw a distinction between internal politics and external politics. And the idea, which is I think very popular among liberal interventionists, not just neoconservatives, but also the likes of our own foreign minister Chrystia Freeland and this sort of liberal strand of interventionists. They like to say that the one leads to the other, that a internally oppressive regime will be an externally aggressive regime. But there is really no data to justify
the evidence
this
doesn't
at all.
support
No,
that
it doesn't
assertion.
support it in any way. So it simply isn't true that just because a state is internally repressive, that it's going to go around invading people or causing trouble internationally. Whereas a state could be, I mean, whose fault? I go back to my statistics. Who actually fights the most wars? Well, it's liberal democracies. So we have to be a lot more careful at separating internal from external politics.
Right. And so a lot of politicians and even just people that think about these things, like regular citizens, voters, people might say, that's all fine and good, Paul, but now the world has, quote, changed. Things are different. We're not talking about states anymore. We're talking about terrorism. Terrorism is a global problem. What do you say to someone who says that well, there clearly are situations where we need to intervene and solve the problem of terrorism, regardless of what country they're on? I think George Bush said something like, or I'm paraphrasing, obviously, and probably not doing a direct quote, but he was basically like, wherever you are, we're going to find you. After that, that was the whole shtick after 9/11.
There's two parts of this. First is like, how big a problem is terrorism for us?
You mean for us as in like this country, let's say?
Well, I'd say this country or Western states in general. And then second, like, does military intervention help? Okay. Well, the first point is like, terrorism is not a big problem for us.
Right.
I don't want to say it's not a problem at all. In 2005, when a bomb went off in London, I and my family were like 200 yards away or something. Right. So I know this kind of stuff can happen, and it's very unpleasant. However, when I was young and a British Army officer in the 1980s, early 1990s, I had to look under my car every time before I got into it, because the IRA were putting bombs under the cars of British soldiers. And in fact, Britain had a lot more terrorism in the 1970s and the 1980s than it does now. Canada had a lot more terrorism in the late 1960s, early 1970s than it does now. I was born in Montreal. My parents lived in Montreal at the time, and they tell me, you could hear the post boxes being blown up on a regular basis. My godmother, who is American, tells me her lecture theatre, she was a student at McGill, her lecture theatre was blown up. Okay, that doesn't happen nowadays. Now, the FLQ didn't kill a lot of people, but nonetheless, there are a lot more incidents than there are now. And if you look at statistics for countries like Canada, Western Europe, North America, the United States, there was a lot more terrorism in the 1980s.
Right.
Similarly, in Latin America, there was an enormous amount of terrorism in the 1980s and 1990s. It was actually, there still is a significant amount of it, but in places like Peru, Colombia, and so on, it's actually declined quite dramatically.
So you're bringing up the point, essentially, is this as big of a problem as it once was?
So it's not actually that big a problem as it was. Now, in recent years, since 9/11, the amount of terrorism worldwide has increased dramatically. And this is, again, we'll come back to this about whether military intervention works, but there has been a dramatic increase statistically in the number of terrorist attacks and the number of fatalities from terrorism since 2001. Mm-hmm. However, when you unpack it, you see that this is concentrated in 5 countries in the world, like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Nigeria, and one of I can't remember. So, but basically, 80% of these terrorist incidents take place in 5 countries.
And those countries sound quite familiar with other lists of things that have been happening.
Right. And yes, other things have been happening, apart from perhaps there's been no military intervention in Nigeria, but there's been some spillover from down through North Africa from the Libyan intervention there. So your odds of being killed by a terrorist in Canada are, tiny. And I don't want to say that means we shouldn't be spending money on CSIS or police and looking into this, because obviously we should, because we want to keep it tiny. But it is best dealt with at that level as a policing and as a criminal matter, as an intelligence and security matter. Okay, because that's the sort of scale of response which it merits.
Not like a foreign relations or foreign affairs issue. This should be a security issue purely, is what you're saying.
Now, but then you say, well, okay, but does military intervention work? The answer, looking since 2001, has to be a massive no, because as I said, there's been a massive increase in terrorism worldwide. Well, in 5 countries since 2001.
And if we say the goal was to reduce it, it clearly didn't happen.
It clearly hasn't. And in fact, since you see that this terrorism is concentrated in countries such as Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, all countries in which we've got military involved, and it has got worse since we've become militarily involved in those countries, it is clearly not working, and it would seem to me has made it worse.
Right.
The idea that intervention in Iraq in particular has made the world safer or has abetted the fight against terrorism is an obvious nonsense, because it quite clearly has made things worse. dramatically worse. Though not for us. And I think this is why politicians are able to get away with it, and why our publics don't complain much about this, because the cost isn't borne by us. Well, I mean, there's a sort of financial cost, and Canada lost 150 soldiers in Afghanistan, but the military is a bit of a closed caste. Most families don't have members who are in the military. It tends to be the same families. It tends to be from certain small social groups. In Canada, like predominantly, was a large amount from the Maritimes and so on. So not everybody, people don't notice it, okay, because it's very few people actually know someone who's killed. And the financial cost is, as you know, the Institute of Liberal Studies on Openness, public choice theory, but the cost is dispersed over everybody. So it may cost Canada $15 billion in Afghanistan, but the average Canadian taxpayer has paid $100 over for 10 years, and so he doesn't really realize that this is costing a lot of money, right?
Put that in perspective. We've all been paying $100 maybe for all that violence and intervention.
Okay, so therefore, there's no great cost for a politician in doing this, but there's an enormous cost for the people who are being intervened against. But we don't care about that because it's not us. And there's one author who described this as, I think it was risk transfer war, which I think is quite a good expression, because of what it shows is now there's a risk that we might be harmed. Okay, so what we're going to do is transfer the risk onto you, the population against whom we're intervening. And then, you die in your thousands, but at least, we have less of a risk. And that's essentially what is going on, I feel. And of course, I mean, we then justify this by saying, we're fighting dictators or something. But
right.
What we're really doing is killing a lot of people so that we can reduce our already pretty tiny chance of being killed by a tiny little bit more. And we don't even actually necessarily succeed in doing that.
And as we were saying before, there may be some military, like strictly military objectives that are achieved. Like you said, there's some people out there that say, well, we never lost a battle. But once again, tying it back to what most people care about, which are the political objectives, they're certainly not being achieved.
But one political objective is being achieved, which is the politicians are able to say that they're doing something.
There you go.
Right?
That they're not the ones caught with their pants down.
Okay,
they're not the ones that aren't doing anything.
But that's often, I think, if you're thinking about the risk, what is the risk which is being transferred to the intervened against population? It's the risk which the politician has of being accused of having done nothing if something were to happen.
Right.
Because it's not that we actually think something necessarily will happen. It's just if we don't do it and something does happen, then I'm going to get blamed.
Right.
So therefore, there is a natural bias among politicians towards action.
And then that's key, that they're operating under a different incentive structure, namely the election cycle primarily.
Yeah, and the incentive structure is an incentive towards action.
Right.
Okay, so politicians always feel they need to do something about any given problem. It's essentially, there's a lot of arse covering going on.
And you were talking about Ron Paul before as an example of someone who did bring about anti-interventionist talking points, but how was he painted, right? It was very easy to see the evidence right in front of us. He was the weak guy on foreign policy. His foreign policy made no sense. This is what people said about him, right?
Yeah.
That if something were to, they always threw at him at the base, well, if something were to happen, what would you do? Like, he was always looked at as this person that wasn't going to do anything if we were attacked or whatever the case may be.
And it's very bizarre if you look at liberal media in the United States, New York Times or something, right? Washington Post, and then suddenly, what are they nice to Trump about? Or when he sends cruise missiles into Syria, suddenly now finally the president, he's being presidential, right. And it's very odd.
I remember noting that as soon as that happened. I said, "Oh, now they love him for about 48 hours." when the bombs went, then they threw into Syria. I was like, "That's interesting."
Yeah, suddenly CNN think he's okay because he's bombing something, which is very strange,
right.
And particularly coming from the media, which is slightly to the left, which was traditionally seen as being more anti-war, but something has happened in terms of political discourse where that is no longer the case.
Before we leave off on the main topic, I want to say, so we talked about a lot about a lot of things here. What are the alternatives to everything we're talking about? Because as we've sort of said, like it oftentimes becomes like you said, the conversation seems to be restricted to: do we wear a seatbelt as we're going off the cliff? Do we want to make sure that the airbags are going to deploy properly? But no one really talks about the car itself. How do we talk about the car itself? Is that just more diplomacy, or is that just too much of a optimistic outlook on my part? Is that like you can't just diplomacy your way out of everything? So how do we improve things? in foreign relations? I know it's very complex, and I know that you're not the person to be asking to make just put a fine point on it, one answer, one silver bullet, because you're not a politician. But how do we at least get there? Is it back to the self-criticism you were talking about?
But it's very difficult. I mean, obviously, I mean, I'm speaking as an academic,
right?
And to say, very easy for me to say, well, we need more self-criticism, but it's not going to happen. So I can make,
not unless we send all the politicians to therapy.
Yeah, and I can make all sorts of nice recommendations, but I know none of them are going to happen. So for instance, if you're concerned about military intervention, which you think is counterproductive, then clearly you need to reduce defense expenditure, because it's very much a case of politicians will use the tools they've got. We have a military which is sitting around doing nothing because no one's going to invade us, and we know no one's going to invade us, right? What are we going to do with all these thousands of people? So there's a temptation just to use them because they're there and they're not doing anything.
Right. I was talking to someone once, and they basically said there is the temptation to use the toys in your toy box. Unfortunately, exactly. That's a reality.
Yeah. So it's I mean, there was a famous occasion when Madeleine Albright, who's Secretary of State under Clinton, wanted to bomb the Serbs, and Colin Powell, who's then chief of the Joint Chief of the Defense Staff in the United States, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think I call it, said, we shouldn't be. I don't think we should do this. It doesn't meet my criteria of being a vital national interest, which we need to use force against. And Madeleine Albright turned around to him and said, "What's the point of having this marvelous military you're always talking about if we never use it?"
Jeez.
Right? And this is kind of the attitude. If you've got the tool in the toolbox, and it's not going to be used for any other reason, because no one is going to attack us militarily. It's just not going to happen. And we know it's not. Then obviously you're going to use it. So the policy of the current last two Canadian governments, which have been to increase defense expenditure. But of course, then recessions happen and things don't increase quite as much as they said they would. But the current government's announced it would increase defense expenditure quite dramatically, 50% or something. I think it was over 10 years or something. That, in my view, is entirely mistaken, because there is no military threat to Canada which could justify that. The only way that could be justified would be in terms of foreign military intervention, right? And so if you create such a interventionist force, we're going to end up using it.
And that's not the way it's presented to people. I mean, there's a lot of fear in this process from politicians too, right? If we don't do X, Y, and Z, the outcome will be that we're going to be attacked. That's one of the attitudes.
So I mean, my solution is we need to, Western states should be cutting defense expenditure, because I don't think it is proved to be constructive, and it leads us down into bad policy options. But then that's kind of like me saying, again, making a policy suggestion I know is not going to happen, right? So the question is, how do you convince politicians that they should do this? And that's very problematic,
right?
Because particularly as they're part of there's huge institutional pressures to do these kind of things, because we're all mixed up in these clubs like NATO, where there's immense peer pressure on people to do these things and to be part of a club and go along. And even if you don't agree with it, you go along with it. So we see, for instance, in the EU, there are certain states who don't agree with the current sanctions regimes against Russia. The Italian government, for instance, and the Greek governments have been, have made it clear that they don't support it. But every time it comes up for a vote, they vote in favor to renew it, because you're part of the club. You can't be the one who rocks the boat. And besides, the Germans might not give you your loan if you don't go in, and whatever, right? So
right.
all sorts of things like this. So I think the current institutional setup we have of international security is not helping either. The problem is then leads, how do you persuade politicians to come up with another, and we just keep coming up with more questions, and how you actually get people to go that way, I don't know, because although I'm very critical of this stuff, the costs of it are very low. Let's be perfectly honest, right? Our war in Afghanistan, our Canadian war in Afghanistan, was a failure, right? I think it's fairly obvious. Although the military across the road down there will, I'm sure, hotly deny it, but basically it was, in terms of achieving higher objectives. But A, getting them to admit it, no way, because it was like, as far as they're concerned, the best thing they've done in years, right? And B, well, what did it cost the average Joe Canadian? Like
nothing really. So I don't.
Back to the dispersed costs you were talking
dispersed
about,
costs.
right?
So unless some way can be found of making the costs clearer or the costs become much greater, I don't think very much is going to change. And that's the vested interest, the particular interests or groups who want to do these kind of things because they have, they have more lobbying power than the people suffering the dispersed costs. And we're back to a classic public choice theory problem. And I don't think, as with all those problems, there's not an easy way out of it.
There's certainly not an easy way out of it in the sense of how do we achieve this and what steps do we take. But I think what you said is very clear, which is I think if the costs of all this became clear to the average person, there might be less of it ultimately.
Yeah.
It might be something that people don't want to choose in the voting booth if they know that those kind of costs are going to be attached to it.
The only way we could do that is by, doing our own little bit to make it clear. But of course, most of the politicians in the media or whatever who are not doing that. So
before we conclude the episode today, I just wanted to say one thing I really enjoyed as I was listening to you was that how you use very plain language on how you describe the interactions between some of these folks on the world stage, because it's not often written about like that in let's say an op-ed in the New York Times. You don't see people write down, for instance, they won't be accepted in the club, or their people will be upset, or there's peer pressure. So I really like that, because it really, as I was saying, it really puts into perspective that that's the kind of, we are still talking about, as we were saying before, human beings. These are the kind of interactions that they are worried about at even that level, right? People, there's a prestige around it for a lot of people on the world stage. That person's going to the UN. Oh my God, right? That person's going to speak there. But like you said, peer pressure, trying to support your quote friends, like Canada did with America and Afghanistan. That these are all real incentives that are put into that are inputs to this.
So I mean, I happen to think that the Canadian foreign policy was much more successful, for instance, back in the Chrétien government. Actually, I think Chrétien government was a lot better than the last two governments in many ways. But if you were to go speak to people at National Defence Headquarters, they were regarded as the black era of doom because there were budget cuts and everything. And they couldn't. They would turn up to a NATO meeting, and no one would listen. Why would you listen to the Canadian? Right, and
so a bit of an inferiority thing going
and
on.
You obviously knew as a general turning up to a NATO meeting that no one took you seriously, and no one cared for you, and you didn't matter what you said, no one was really going to listen to you. Whereas when you fight a war in Afghanistan, and suddenly people, suddenly you can walk in and people will shake your hand and people want to listen to you a little bit, and you think that's a good thing, and it's not that you're being selfish, because you will associate your own increased prestige with somehow increased influence of your state over other states. Now, that's not necessarily true. In fact, maybe you're not really having any more influence, but that's the way you will associate it. Right. So these sort of issues of peer pressure and prestige and personal status and so on, they do matter, and they do affect the way politics operates.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that these people, they do go to their own, I want to try some plain language here, they go to their own social clubs, they have their own parties, right?
Yeah.
They do talk amongst yourself. Like I said, there are other incentives at play that isn't just getting down to business in the policy paperwork when they go to these places.
In every sphere of policy, be it security policy or health policy or whatever sphere it is, there is a sort of club, right? And you want to feel you're part of it.
You and I certainly weren't invited to that club, so we can't tell.
No, and I'm never going to be invited. I'm fairly confident about it.
That's too bad. I wish they would invite
Again,
you.
I think there's a self-selective thing. If you say these things, you don't get invited.
Right. Well, if I was organizing, I'd make you keynote speaker. So there you go. You can set them straight. So we've been talking about a lot. Let's bring it full circle and put a finer point, although it may be very tough on tough issues like this. But what do you hope are the main takeaways for someone listening here today on whether or not military intervention works, if we could sum it up?
I would say that the use of military force to achieve specific policy goals is unwise. Generally, it generally doesn't work as a precision tool to achieve some certain political or security objective. It is something. Force is something you use, and war is something you wage when you are directly threatened, when someone has attacked you, when your life is in immediate danger. Okay, if you're the Soviet Union, when Nazis have invaded you or whatever, right? You fight because your existence depends on it, and it would be bizarre if you did not fight. Okay, But beyond that, the idea that you can pick up violence and you can pick up war, and then have in your sight some policy objective, be it stability in the Middle East, or defeating terrorism, or promoting human rights, and precisely use it to advance that goal successfully, is extremely unwise and doesn't reflect the nature of the beast, that is to say, of war itself, which is something which is inherently difficult to control, inherently unpredictable. As Clausewitz said, there's no other human activity so much bound up with chance as war. So remember, if you're thinking about war, okay, it is a gamble. That's what Clausewitz said. He said it's like a game of cards. You're gambling.
It's not a precise political tool by any means.
Not by any means. And you're gambling with odds which are stacked against you.
I think that's a great way to wrap it up. Paul Robinson, thank you very much for speaking with me today. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. This episode of The Curious Task was produced by Alex Aragona and Sabine L. Chidiak. Our executive producer is Matt Buffton. The music you heard on today's episode was created by Lindy Voppenfjord. You should check out his other stuff online. The Curious Task exists today because of donations of time and money from those creating it and listeners like yourself. Check us out on Patreon and find out how you can support us and get access to exclusive offers. I'm Alex Aragona. Thank you very much for joining us on The Curious Task.